Longlegs is the fourth feature film by writer-director Oz Perkins, and is likely to be his breakout success. As someone who does appreciate both the horror genre and the many performances of Nicolas Cage, discussions around this film had me intrigued, and expecting an experience that was, at the very least, unique. Opening in 4:3, the film gives us just a glimpse of the titular antagonist before abruptly cutting to some extremely loud opening titles, as the aspect ratio slowly morphs into widescreen. On the one hand, the music and bare-bones typography feel like an intentional juxtaposition to the bleak subject matter. Like so many contemporary horror features, Longlegs flirts with the idea of being a sensory, unconventional art house experience, but under the surface it's revealed to be a shallower and safer film than you might have expected, or hoped at least. The most visually and viscerally striking moments of the film occur in the first 30 minutes, during slower and more contemplative scenes where the story is not being particularly advanced in any way. People will have their own opinions on the degree of intentionality in this style of filmmaking, but to me the visual presentation became less thoughtful and less impressive as the film went on. I wouldn't go as far as saying the film completely stops approaching its visual choices in creative ways, but the way the film plays out leads me to believe that there was less intention in Perkins' earlier decisions than maybe I had initially thought. For the most part, this film is aesthetically outstanding. On a budget of under $10 million, most films, specifically horror films, do not look like this. The cinematographer and his team shouldn't be undervalued in their contribution to Longlegs' visual achievements. In conjunction with the editing, Longlegs' greatest success is arguably its presentation. That is, of course, outside of... Maika Monroe plays protagonist Lee Harker, an emotionally stunted, socially infantile FBI agent. I think this material must be extremely difficult for an actor to work with, but she delivers an excellent performance which was ultimately one of the most memorable parts of the film. You really get the sense that this is a person struggling to overcome a kind of mental barrier, like she's pushing against something deep inside her just to be able to communicate with people. As a protagonist, she helps to facilitate the mystery of this narrative, even if her actions are not always easily empathised with. But like always, Nicolas Cage will of course be the main performance people will discuss in relation to this film. Cage was intentionally hidden in the marketing for Longlegs, trying to establish a sense of horrifying anticipation in the lead up to this film. This meticulous mystery was almost immediately destroyed by the loud declaration of his name in the opening titles, which I think was an immersion-breaking and kind of cheap editing choice after a genuinely unsettling and muted setup. Specific editing choices around his performance kept me from ever fully getting what I think was the intended experience. In spite of the creepy prosthetics, I never really forgot the fact that it was Nicolas Cage. I feel the direction was slightly lacking here. I know how great he can be, but at times it really did feel like Perkins had just switched the camera on and let him do whatever he wanted. The other performances are kind of not even worth discussing given the shallowness of the character writing and presumably the direction they were given. Agent Carter felt massively underdeveloped and was portrayed as such a one-note straight man that his later heel turn was nothing short of hilarious. Alicia Witt as Ruth Harker was possibly the worst performance in the entire film, but again, I don't fault the actress for this. The character is nothing short of a stereotype, and telegraphs all of the later plot points just by virtue of the fact that we know what to expect from a horror character we've seen 8,000 times. The film's third and final act is where the whole thing unfortunately kind of fell apart for me, and this is due to one thing. Despite being written and directed by the very same person, Longlegs is a film in conflict with itself. At this point, I can't count the number of horror films with promising visual directions that fall victim to the very same issue, all because of their writing. Atmospheric lighting and unique camera and editing choices can allow us to not only forgive ambiguity and confusion in a film's first act, but to perceive this as an intentional evocation of mystery that promises to later be rewarded. It's a cliche, but this is a film that encourages you to lean in and pay attention, having faith that by the end, enough of your questions will have been answered to have made this a satisfying, horrifying experience. Like so many horror films of the current generation, however, I would argue that this film actually answers too many of those questions. The unique, mysterious approach of this film's setup is completely sold short when the payoff is an unfortunate regurgitation of themes and plots we've seen 1,000 times before. And sure, that can still be entertaining, but when a film looks like it could be giving us something new and turns out just to be something I've seen 1,000 times before, is there anything that I can take away from my surface level experience with this film? When a religious or supernatural element forms an integral part of a seemingly competent art house horror, I immediately assume that the film will be ripe with subtext and allegory, often the elements cited as providing underlying value for a piece of art. Of course, the doll maker and the dolls themselves have a greater meaning beyond the material use in the film. I just felt so underwhelmed by their cliche inclusion that I'm honestly somewhat curious about the metaphorical implications, and those seem to be the entire point of the film. It's rare for horror writers today to not include some form of levity in their work in the form of light comedy, and Longlegs is no exception. I'm always curious to know whether this usually comes as a result of creative intuition, or whether it's always notes from the production companies themselves. The dynamic between Lee and Agent Carter felt like it was intended to embody an almost Seven-style buddy cop duo, with comedic and genre-specific moments like her awkward introduction to the family. While I didn't necessarily have a problem with this for the most part, and actually found the scene where Lee talks to Carter's daughter to be amusing, looking at all of this in the greater context of the film, I struggle to understand the purpose of its inclusion in the story. In the end, Longlegs is not what I would consider to be a bad film, but it definitely disappointed me. Not because of the marketing or anyone overhyping it, but because of the promise shown by the director within the film itself. Unfortunately, the nature of this type of film places most of the burden on the strength of its final act. With the script aside, many elements of this film are above average, and it was a decent experience overall, even if maybe I'd hoped for something great. 6 out of 10.